those of us who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, we went to stores. Retail stores and shopping malls and complexes and strip malls. Big box retailers and mom and pop shops. In the days before widespread internet, when the best place to buy music online was CD Baby and Amazon only sold books, brick and mortar stores were really our only sensible option. See, for my brother and I, though, it was movie rentals. That's where we spent a lot of time. Nearly every Sunday evening, my family would go to the Green Jade Chinese Buffet on Franklin Ave in Nutley, New Jersey. And my mom and my grandfather and sister would sit there and eat, and my brother and I, we'd eat really fast, right? We'd suck down our sweet and sour chicken and our pork fried rice, and we were long done before everyone else was. And they would sit there eating crab legs by the dozen, and my brother and I would be bored to tears, and eventually one of us would say, can we go next door to Blockbuster? And invariably the answer was yes. So my brother and I would go next door to Blockbuster, and we would walk the aisles and just be in awe. It was rows and rows of movies. It was our early film education, taught by cover art and teaser paragraphs on giant VHS boxes. It was always so much fun to just wander the aisles and experience all this media through osmosis without even seeing any of it. And more importantly, it was a chance for us to connect. For video games, it was Funkoland and Electronics Boutique. We had a Best Buy kind of rolled into town around the year 2000, and we always had a Circuit City, but the smaller mall shops were like clubhouses. It was a place where kids and teens connected over demo consoles playing Mario 64 and Tomb Raider, where if you knew the guys at the counter, they'd let you play an extra 10 minutes of Cruisin' USA before kindly shooing you away, and then look the other way and not really care if you came back 10 minutes later. It was a place where ideas came together. It was a place where people came together over a fandom that was still considered relatively niche. And yeah, maybe I'm an old fart, but it was special. It was truly special. On this episode of A Gamer Looks at 40, I talk with two people who not only worked behind those counters, but built lifelong connections via a vibrant, independent video game store that, for the better part of a decade, was a unique entity in a town that prides itself for being a little left of center. Let's join Julien of the Nerds Without Pants podcast, an actor, cartoonist, and contributor to the Digital Noise podcast, John Gholsen, as we explore life behind the counter, stories from the video game retail store. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time out today. What we're going to be talking about is, I think, a special part of the late 90s, early 2000s gamer experience, which is the video game store. Going to the video game store, checking out games, playing examples and playing the demo stations. And you guys were both heavily involved in a video game store here in Austin, Texas, Game Fellas. And what I'd like to do is just pick your brain about the experience. How was it working in that store, being in that environment, meeting people, just a kind of capture what it felt like to be in that world. So, Julien, I'll start with you. How did you get started at Game Fellas, and kind of just take it from there?
Yeah, so I go back pretty far with it. I think I had first run into it at the original location at North Cross Mall back then, if anybody who's listening is old time Austinites. And I was probably 11 or 12 maybe, because I think I remember seeing Mega Man 6 on the shelf there, so it would have been around that era. Mm-hmm. But I didn't go to that mall very often. It was years later, probably 1996-ish, that I ran into what would be the main store that I would end up working at the Barton Creek Mall. And it was a really cool experience because I went in there and I was just kind of looking around, and I just happened to ask about like a fighting stick for the PlayStation. And the guy working behind the counter was like, yeah, we got this one. You want to try it out? And I was like, I can try it out?
Wow.
Like, yeah, sure. And like he plugged it in and we played a couple matches together. And I was like, and I was just really enamored with that initial experience. And so I started shopping there all the time. And I got my first job at a supermarket as soon as I turned 16. Yeah, so it would have been like right before I turned 16 that I started shopping there. So once I started like having income, it all went to Game Fellas. Like I would get paid on Friday, and my mom would take me to the mall either Friday or Saturday, and I would go in and be like, well, gentlemen, what's new this week? And they would be like, oh, well, this came out. And I would like try it out and be like, that seems acceptable. I will take this. And it just kept going like that. And at some point, I had gotten to the point where I felt like my Nintendo 64, like I had bought it at launch and had bought one additional game since the 2 launch titles, which was Doom 64, which we talked about before, Bill.
Right.
And nothing else. And I was like, I don't think the 64 is giving me what I want from it. So I took it in and I traded it in, and I also traded in like a bunch of like PlayStation games that I was done with. And the manager, Ben, was taking the trade from me, and he was looking at my games and he was like, these are yours? And I was like, yeah. He's like, they look brand new. And I was like, well, yeah, I like to take care of my stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, but I think that was like the moment when he saw me as like more than a customer and a potential hiree.
Wow. Because
then it was like right before November of 1997 that he asked if I wanted to do like a part-time seasonal job. And I was like, yeah, I do. And I will never forget the moment that I stepped behind the counter for the first time, because it was like, just walking into like gamer's paradise. There was like mountains of games just piled up behind the testing TV rack. And then when you went into like the back room, there was like stacks of like NESs and Super Nintendos, like 6 feet high, you know, three consoles deep. And I was just in heaven. And it was later on that I realized, I have to actually like kind of clean and organize this stuff, because they weren't, for whatever reason, the store was not nearly as organized as it ended up being like when I started working there. I don't know why that was. It ended up becoming like a much more like well-oiled machine. But when I first started, it was kind of organized chaos, but oh man, like I'm going to get emotional a lot during this episode, because the more I think about Game Fellas, the more I realize that it was my Sandlot.
Wow.
It's like that thing from my youth that I always go back to fondly. And they were like the best years of my life. I worked there for 8 years. From 1997 to 2005 when we closed. Yeah. And I pretty much, I left right before we closed. I almost went down with the ship, but I kind of couldn't go down with the ship just because things got real bad for me financially. But I was one of the last people on board the ship.
Yeah, man. Well, it's interesting that I think it's a couple things there, and then John, I'll chat with you about your start there. But I love the fact that the old school places would always let you try things. Let's try it out. Try out this game stick, which could not have been cheap. I mean, I don't know much about fighting games, but I know those accessories they're not cheap, right? But the idea that he was like, yeah, just give it a shot, try it. You know, I think that's really, really cool. And the fact that the manager saw you in late 1997 and said, wait a minute, I think this kid has a passion for this. You know, just by the titles you were returning, and I think that's really cool. He was able to recognize that and started something special. John, when did you get started with Game Fellas?
So I was brought in there because of a game that I wanted. I wanted Lunar Silver Star, the Atlas release, like the big box with Lunar Silver Star in it. And at the time, I had moved to Austin summer of 98. And the first job that I got was as assistant manager at KB Toys in Barton Creek Mall. And so I was working there. So I would walk past Game Fellas pretty much every day on my way to work. And I wanted Lunar, and I knew Lunar was going to be one of those games that I wasn't going to be able to just go to Best Buy or Walmart and like buy. off the shelf. And I was scared it would sell out, and I didn't think my store would get it at all. I didn't think KB Toys would get it at all. So I would drop in every couple of days and just ask, "Hey, is Lunar out? Is Lunar out? Is Lunar out?" I'm sure Julien has a different perspective of me as a customer, because he got to experience me as a customer before he ever got to experience me as a coworker. And even then, even as a coworker, I think Julien and I, shortly after we were working together, we kind of had different paths with Game Fellas. But yeah, my origin story at working at a game store was I had worked as assistant manager and manager at movie theaters and video stores and things like that. So if you've been trusted with a position like that, it's pretty easy to be slotted in as like a second key at the very least, because it's, you have it on your resume. So I can't remember what. I have a really difficult time remembering applying for a job there, to tell you the truth. I think because I was working at at KB, and I was working at the movie theater up until the time that Star Wars Episode 1 came out. And I want to say that I quit the theater right after Episode 1, and I may have just been on the hunt for a second job. And it may have been one of those things that's just as simple as me like walking into the store and saying like, "Hey, are you guys hiring?" Sure. And then the manager of the store handing me an application, or letting me fill out an application. I think it happened that way. My fear, I can speak about my fear, because I remember that stronger than my actual hiring process. My fear was that everybody there was like just the most otaku of otaku. Like my fear was that they were going to leave me in the dust. Like I was going to daily be caught with my pants down because I wasn't going to know the Japanese title of the third sequel of some game. And and that's the way I looked at the guys as a shopper when I was going into Game Fellas was, oh, these guys know their stuff. Right. And like, what do I know? Like, I don't know that I know things. Like I play games. I kind of know things. I read this PlayStation magazine. Like, I don't know how much I actually know. And I think the biggest thing for me was the discovery that like, oh, everybody only kind of knows what they know. And like, I knew stuff that other people didn't know, and other coworkers knew things I didn't know. So, that's the part of a team, right? Is like everybody has their strengths, and we all play to each other's strengths and weaknesses. And that was by far my biggest fear, was coming into a world where I felt like I was going to be really ill-equipped to help customers to the degree that these guys were. And I was okay. I did fine. I acquitted myself nicely. So.
Right. And clearly though, you felt like you were still welcomed, even though you may not have known the third Japanese name of some weird, right?
Well, my deal was going in simply with experience and going, I've worked retail. Right. Hey, I can count the money. I can be kind to customers. And so I wasn't so scared that I didn't apply. And honestly, it was a case of if I needed the job, it was a case of like, where would I want? Back then, I was motivated a lot more by where would I want to go every day? And I worked in toys. I worked in toy stores and movie theaters and video stores because those were places I would want to go every day. And I knew at least I would be personable to customers, and I could handle just the the things, the ins and outs of working retail. That was the stuff that I knew, like I can do that. Even if I don't know this other stuff, I can, and I'm not afraid to say I don't know. So if somebody comes and asks me, I'm not afraid to go, I don't know. Hey, Ben, or hey, Julien, It's like, I don't have that problem. So, so as nervous as I was about coming in, I think those fears were laid to rest pretty quick. I think Julien has told me before that when I used to come into the store, that he thought I was like a stick in the mud, that I was like a total square, and that I was like 100% serious 100% of the time. And Julien has relayed the story to me that when he found out that I was being hired, I think Julien even kind of rolled his eyes and was like, that guy.
I think I said he's going to put me to sleep if I have to work with him.
It's so funny because I was going to ask, like, so Julien, what was your first impressions of John? So boring evidently was the first impression. That's great.
Yeah, it's funny because me and John have become very close friends since, but I think there was definitely a warming up period.
Sure.
I remember a very specific moment because we would like move stores a lot, because like the mall, they would move us around, and we opened and closed a lot of like special locations in our time. Like I've counted it before, but I think I want to say that I've like broken down and like put together something along the lines of like 20 different iterations of Game Fellas during the 8 years.
Whoa. Wow.
But I remember one time, like we were moving stuff in the mall and it was late at night, and John was just like, Julien. And he was like, I just kind of like your name, but like for Susu Studio, but with your name. And then I just remember like that was kind of like my first like kind of real fun like interaction with him. Yeah. And we just kind of slowly grew closer. And I think it's just because the I don't want to sound cliche, but Game Fellas was a lot like a big family, because it felt like we had personal stake in the store. We didn't own the store, but we all felt a sense of ownership over the store. And I think it all brought us together. And, we would stay, like, we would close the store and do the paperwork and then stay and play games, or we would like go over to each other's homes and like have little gaming parties and stuff like that. And once I started running my own store, like I ended up getting a really awesome crew, and I actually had to make a rule that was like, okay, guys, if you're scheduled off, you can't come to the store and hang out all day.
Right.
Because it was like, they would just stay like someone, like if someone had the morning shift, like, 10 to 1 or 10, 10 to 2,
yeah, they
would then stay until close and just like hang out with whoever was working the evening shift. And it was like, okay, like if you're not working, you gotta leave.
And I can see that too, because it is a business establishment, right? It's a store and it's there for retail purposes. But I love the idea of this store being kind of a hangout of sorts, a place where, like you said, it's a very good place that you had stake in it. You had a care for it, even though you were working, I'm sure an hourly wage perhaps, and didn't have an ownership in it. You felt attached to it. And usually, in my experience, that's all because of the people.
Yes.
That's the number one binding glue. So tell me a bit about some of the people that you've come across in your time at time at Game Fellas. I'd love to hear more of the people that kind of made up that crew almost.
Yeah, so there were multiple locations, and so the main one was the Barton Creek store. That's the one that I started at. So it starts with Ben, the manager, who is just a cool dude. I started calling him boss, like capital B, after like the top ranking in Metal Gear Solid, because that was like the respect that I had for him. And even now, like I don't really talk to him very often, but anytime that I have any interaction with him, I'm like, hey, how's it going, boss? Because cool. He like I told him after I left, I was like, I have a lot of like different supervisors, but you're the only boss that I've ever had. Like you're the boss. And I still feel that way today. And I don't know, man, we just had like a cast of characters. James Kalunga, who we all called Kalunga, to the fact that John didn't know that his name was James for a good long time. Because we only called him Kalunga. Was just the most enthusiastic, hyperactive dude. Like whenever we like get around the campfire and like start to tell like old Game Fella stories, a lot of them involve Kalunga, because he was just hilarious. And if he got a milkshake in him, like you just kind of couldn't stop him.
That was it.
Yeah, like I remember like when we were playing NBA Street, and it was just me and him working on a Sunday, and it was kind of slow. And he was talking about, oh man, I love all of those different dunks. And he started like doing all of the animations behind the counter. He's like slip and slide, and just and there was one time when. So the thing with Game Fellas, right? And I think it's worth going back to later, is that at the time there weren't a lot of places to buy video games, especially like John said, you weren't going to find Lunar at very many places, right?
Sure. Right.
And so that made Game Fellas kind of special right out of the gate. But because of that, and because we were in the mall, and the mall takes their cut, for the majority of Game Fellas' life, like we were like about $5 higher than normal like retail price for new games. And so a customer came in one day and he told James, well, I can find that for $5 less at Walmart. And James looked at me and he blinked a couple times. He said, okay. And, and then the customer like asked a couple more questions and he left. And then we were kind of talking about that. I was like, dude, what was that? He's like, well, what am I going to do? Like, oh, it's $5 cheaper. Let me go right now. And then he hops over the counter and he's like, I got to go right now. And he starts running for the door. It was just stuff like that. And you want to take over, John? Like some of the other
there was, peeps? I think that the structure of the stores is important to talk about for the context and how so historically, Julian's right. Like at the time that Game Fellas opened, you're talking about there's Funko Land and there's Babbage's, like
and EB
and then those are places that primarily carry computer games and some brand new games. We hadn't seen EB become what EB became later and then became GameStop. That's kind of around the time that Game Fellas starts to really take a hit is when every single corner strip mall has a GameStop on it. But we're talking about like a time before then. And so the function of the store is a more rare thing. You're not seeing places that are selling games for older systems for one. And you're not seeing people carry one of everything, like trying to at least carry one of everything at any given time.
Yeah, even stuff like Easter Bunny's Big Day for PlayStation 1. Like we ordered that brand new for some reason.
But to put it in further perspective, there was a sense of competition with places like Funko Land and EB, but the structure of Game Fellas created a sense of competition within itself because there were two owners basically, and one of them ran one of the stores in a different mall, and one of them ran the store in Barton Creek Mall. And it was almost like you're competing against yourself. Like Game Fellas was competing against Game Fellas because we would hear customers come into our store and tell us things about North Cross. And I'm sure it was happening at North Cross as well, where they had people going in there and telling them stuff about us. But it made us up our game because we wanted to be better than the other Game Fellas across town. Right. And it's kind of funny to talk about because it's one of those things that's like, unless you were working there, like it doesn't make any sense as to why we would be so competitive within the club itself. But yeah, we felt like we were Team Teresa, so to speak. So we were out for her best interest and wanted her to feel the most pride in our store and not let the other owner feel like they had the better store. Is that inaccurate to say, Julian?
Oh, not at all. But let's also be clear that like there was a much different mentality from the top at the North Cross store and the other stores because North Cross, like they would never like identify themselves when they would answer the phone. Like there was just like a much lower level of overall customer service and like pleasantness. Where I think that's because of like just kind of the way that Paul kind of ran things, and Teresa and even more so Ben, because Ben was in the store all day, every day except Sundays. Just really dictated kind of the pace and the personality of the store. So we were just like generally much friendlier, and we didn't keep people from hanging out at the store trying games all day because like you mentioned that like stores will let you try stuff, Bill, but at least back in our day, that was not a regular thing. And it certainly wasn't, hey, you can try pretty much anything that we have in the store.
Sure.
So, and that was also a big thing for us on the customer service side, because like John said, it's like somebody asks about a game and it's like, I don't know, Julien, did you try that one? It's like, yeah, I tried that one. I liked that one a lot. Or it was a situation where, no, we haven't tried it. Do you want to try it? And, and then we would actually watch the person playing it to get like a little more informed opinion on what that game was. So we tended to have like this very like, John could definitely speak to this. We got our hands on most of the stuff that came out during that time. That's and so could cool. At least, make an educated comment about anything, even if it wasn't our particular cup of tea.
Sure. It was also. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, John.
It was also a good mix of people who cared. I think that has a lot to do with it. Julien and I ended up managing our own stores separate from the Barton Creek location where we met. And Julien and I may have had very different approaches to being a manager, but we both were deeply cared and we both were personally invested. And I can think about like where we learned that was really Barton Creek. And as far as like, you don't walk into a game store, to put this in context and not have it just be a story that's like, you know, back in the day, but like to think about it now, if you go into a GameStop, they're behind the counter, they're saying, "Hey, how you doing? Can I help you find anything?" And that's where the conversation ends.
If you get that.
Yeah. If you even get that.
If you get that. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, you know, thinking about Game Fellows, it was a small thing, but it was more of a concierge service of like, "Hey, what are you playing right now? Oh, let me interest you in this," and walk them over to it. Like, and it wasn't like we were trained to do that. We just ended up with a confluence of people who cared about games, were enthusiastic about games, wanted to see the store be successful, and we're just passionate about it. Like, wanted to talk to people about it, you know. And it's like, I can't remember the last time an employee in a game store has taken me to a section and been like, "Oh, I'm playing this right now. I love it. It's freaking awesome." And like, those were conversations that we were having every hour on the hour, nonstop in those stores. And I don't mean to be, this is where I start to feel like an old man, like telling a story. But things were different back then. We cared about the games, damn it. But it's serious though. Like, I'm being totally serious in this fact that like, you know, somebody would come in and it wouldn't just be, "Can I help you find anything?" "No." "Okay, good. Because that means I don't have to talk to you." It's like,
right.
"Can I help
you
find anything?"
Here and,
"No." And I see them at the GameCube wall. I'm going to say, "Hey, this GameCube game just came out." Like, I'm just going to tell it to them, you know, and then see where that conversation goes. Like, I'm not letting the conversation end at, "I don't need any help." I mean, you do sometimes if you're busy doing other things, but I mean, typically we're going a little further. But I think we all knew that we had to, because we couldn't compete on a price level. I mean, we're a mom and pop boutique in a mall, and like, to Julian's point of the games being $5 more, it's because there's like hardly any profit margin on games or systems or anything like that. You know, we did a lot of used sales stuff. There's higher profit margins on those things, but it was a matter of like, what can we do that's different? Well, we can't turn it down to $20 as quick as Walmart can. Like, if a game comes out that's $50 and then Walmart's blowing it out for 20 because they ordered too many copies, we can't necessarily go there. But what we can do is we can tell you what the game's like, or we can, again, put a controller in your hand and let you play it. And those are things that, like, people talk about the death of mom and pops in regards to the online experience. But I don't think that I think it's because the online experience ended up replicating the retail experience, and the online's more convenient. I think it's a matter of retail had already gone to crap. People weren't getting that hands-on touch anyways, so why not order online? I think if more retailers had that deeper investment in the customers, then the switch to online wouldn't have been as fast as it ended up happening in the past 20 years.
I think that's fair. And it's interesting when you mentioned that. In my other role is I write for a blog in town, and I do a lot of food and beverage. I used to do a lot of food and beverage stuff. And I would always say, if I had to pick between the food being good, the ambiance being good, or the service being good, I'll take service over the other two every single time. I'll be okay if the sandwich is a little cold, as long as the service is good. I could care less if I'm in a barn. You know, if the food's good and the service is awesome, I'm happy. But so service, I think, is really interesting in that personal touch and creating those personal connections. Right? You walk up to somebody and you are genuinely want to talk about the games, and B, you're excited about the stuff you're selling. You know, that's a rarity these days. And especially, I'm not trying to slag off on the GameStops of the world, because it's probably easy to do so. And real people do work at those places and could have that passion. But when the environment isn't set up for that, it's very hard to find people who are going to feel passionate about it. You know what I mean? When there's,
they're
like
not
you said, there's one on every corner. Right. When there's one on every corner, and GameStop, you know, as you all know, because you've opened stores, you know, GameStop comes in and gets rid of a small mom and pop shop. They have no problem just leaving if the place isn't profitable enough. And now you have nothing. It's an invasive disease. Like, it goes in, eats, and then it just leaves, and then now you have no game store whatsoever.
Seen that.
So it's too. Sure, absolutely. You know, it's the Starbucks theory. So,
and I think that it's I don't want to, like, you know, because it's hard for me to get over the anti like EB/GameStop mentality because we were indie for so long. And I, you know, like I bought something from GameStop just a week ago and like I'm gritting my teeth like, I feel so
Damn
dirty.
exclusives. Oh, man.
But I will say that I don't believe that it's because like they don't have people working there that are passionate about games or anything like that. I think that the actual corporate structure kind of stamps that passion out of them because like, well, you got to sell these magazine subscriptions and you got to sell these, you know, these batteries and all of this stuff to make your numbers, and not because I think John and we definitely took a different approach. So like when someone would come into my store, I would greet them and say, can I help you find anything? And they'd say, oh no, I'm just looking. It's like, okay. And then I'd let them browse for a while. And then if they were still in the store, you know, and just really milling about it, I would say, is there anything in particular you were looking for? And then that would kind of start like, oh, I was looking for something like this. And then that's where I got to shine, where it was like, oh yeah, well, you know, if you're looking for that type of game, I like this, this, and this. I would never suggest more than 3. Okay. And I would let them know like, okay, this is why I like this one. You know, this one's got really cool features. And then kind of like feel them out based on, you know, where they're going on there. And then like John said, it was kind of like it's almost like, you know, like working at a shoe store or something. It's like, well, let's try this one out. You know, let me put this one on for you and let's see what you think. Right. And I'm very pleased to say that, to my knowledge, I never had anybody that I personally recommended a game to come back and return it because they didn't like it.
Wow. That's cool.
And that was always like a mark of honor for me. And I think that's part of why I love it on Nerds Without Pants when a listener comes back and they're like, "Oh man, I bought that game because of how you talked about it. I love it." I'm like, that's so good.
That's
that
so
makes me
nice.
feel so good.
We also had something different that I haven't thought about in years, which was we could check out the games.
Yes. So
if there was a new release, we were able to speak on it, even if we didn't own it, because we could take it home as long as we brought it back by the time the store opened the next day, depending on how many copies of there were. There were some other things too, but. I'd actually hadn't thought about the fact that we could take the stuff home, and that helped a lot in being able to assist customers. And that's something that I know that the chain stores are unable to do. So it makes a situation where they can't speak to the games in the same way. Again, it's not the employees; it's that it's not being fostered it's not being fostered from like a company structure level. It has nothing to do with whether the guy behind the counter is passionate or not, or knows anything about retail. It's just that type of service and mentality is not what's being prioritized by the parent company.
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to send a friendly neighborhood shout out to our friendly neighborhood patrons, Pete Harney and Ryan from the Gamers Week podcast. Both of these pillars of society support the show on patreon.com, and you can too by going to patreon.com/agamerlooksaat4040. Both of my tiers are there, so check it out. And if one of them strikes your fancy, feel free to sign up and support the show monetarily. Some cool perks are there, so be sure to check it out. That's patreon.com/agamerlooksaat40. So I would like to kind of pivot a little bit towards the actual experience of being there. Since you guys, I mean, Julien, you've been there, we were there 8 years, and John, around how long were you there?
Oh gosh. So summer 99 until, I'm trying to think of when
San Antonio closed.
2004. No, because I worked over on, I worked at the strange William Cannon store for almost
you did? That's
year.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So then that would have been 2005. Yeah, that would have been the same year. I was going to
say, and then 2005 is when I moved away. So I think I worked there until, I think spring 2004 is when I stopped. So 99 to 2004. It is a very concentrated period of time. And when I say it out loud, it's like, oh, that's really no time at all. That's 5 years. In that 5 years, I worked at 3 different spots in Barton Creek Mall, 3 different spots in Barton Creek Mall, 2 different spots in Highland Mall, 2 different San Antonio stores, and a store on William Cannon. So there's more stores, there's more physical locations that I worked in over those 5 years. So it makes that 5 years seem like like a very storied history. And honestly, even in that concentrated period of time, again, so much happened. I came onto that store in summer of 99. That's really when Pokemon broke, and it's like that stuff had just come out. So I got to see all of that happen. And then I got to see like the PlayStation 2, you know, the first and only E3 that I've been to was like Xbox and GameCube debuting, and the PlayStation 2, I think it's second year at E3 or something like that.
Yeah. Wow.
And so we got to see these systems that changed the whole landscape of consoles. We got to see that come out, and we got to see the retail landscape completely change. So in that concentrated 5-year period of time, we went from, oh, nobody's interested in old games, they're worthless, and there's not really any game stores, to like, there's a proliferation of game stores. Classic gaming becomes like a highly collectible thing. I mean, all those things happened within that 5-year period of time, which is also probably why in my brain it feels so much longer to me.
Can we talk real briefly about Christmas of '99?
Go for it.
Okay, so right before the holiday season of 1999, we were like, Highland Mall came to Teresa and said, "Hey, do you want to open a store?" And she was like, "Sure." And so me, Teresa, Ben, and Joe, who was the assistant manager, basically put together an entire store over the Thanksgiving weekend. And at the same time, we had just opened our first store in San Antonio. Mm-hmm. But Ben was doing all of the ordering for all 3 of these locations, and this was, you know, the beginning of Pokemon Fever.
Yes.
So not only, and for context, there was a Game Boy Color shortage. So we were trying to get those whenever we could. We were also pushing the Neo Geo Pocket Color whenever we could, because we were all very passionate about that, and we could actually get those in stock.
Right.
The Dreamcast was out. And then Pokemon was going crazy. And so Teresa was ordering tons and tons of Pokemon merchandise and cards and stuff. Ben was ordering tons and tons of consoles and games and everything just to keep on top of things. And it would all come to Barton, and then we would like distribute the stuff to the other 2 locations, you know, whoever was in charge of that. So we would get to these situations where we were so busy that we would have like 5 people working the counter, and each of those people would have like 5 people in waiting in line, because we were old school, Bill. We did handwritten receipts, so each of us was basically a register.
Wow.
And on top of that, we have these mountains of like shipment boxes that are just in the middle of the floor that we can't get to until we close. And
man.
I worked a 23-hour shift at one point that season, and then Ben, Joe, and I worked a 40-hour shift, or over that, because we ended up like, it took so long. Like, I think we opened to close, and then we spent all night like putting away stock, and we were all like, well, there's not really any point in going home, so we just kept working. And I eventually just like went like passed out, and apparently like my grandparents came to visit, and I was just completely unconscious in my room. Like my mom had to tell me about it later. Like there are sections of that entire holiday season that I don't remember, because it was insane.
That sounds like that's what a combination of things happened.
Yes.
You know, new consoles, a whirlwind called Pokemon, right? Like that's John, what was some of your experience during that?
Some of my favorite customer stories are from the Pokemon craze days, because I came full time. I ended up quitting KB Toys that Christmas. I believe, I think 98 was the Furby Christmas, because it was like Furbies and Pokemon, and it was like, you've never seen adults act like they've lost their mind so much.
Yeah, my dad hunted high and low for Furbies. I remember him coming home with like 4 of them. I found a white one. I'm like, we're gonna hold on to this for 30 years. Be worth $100,000. Literally, that was the idea. That was the thought process.
I ended up. I think I left KB Toys that Christmas. That was when I left, and then I came full time with Game Fellows shortly after that. So I came in probably right as this stuff was going on. What Julien and Ben and the rest of the crew were dealing with on the Game Fellows side, because I was still just part time. And some of my favorite stories are from the Pokemon days, because it was insane. Working at the Highland Mall store, which was always intended to be a temporary store, meant that you pretty much only carried like, we had like we were concerned about making sure we had the big titles and making sure we had plenty of Pokemon. And there were these 2 kids, and I'll never forget this. It was crazy to me, and I don't know where they were getting the money. They would come in, they would buy about $500 worth of unsealed Pokemon boxes, like the whole card boxes, then sit there on the counter, open them all up, and leave. They'd be gone maybe an hour and a half, and they would spend another $500, like $500 cash. Just, and these are children. Like these were like, it was two brothers, and they must have been 8 or 9. Like they weren't even preteens. And then they would come back with another $500-600, buy a bunch of unopened cases, open them all, and then leave. And they would do this 3-4 times, so that by the end of the day, like you've done $1,000 in Pokemon cards, and it's all been from the same 2 kids.
That's crazy.
It was
wow.
It was wild, and I still to this day don't know where they were, like how they were, like making this money appear. One of my favorite customer stories of all time, though, is there was a kiosk. So there was a Pokemon kiosk that we had that was in the hallway of the mall, and I was standing at the kiosk, and there was a kid with the brown paper bag, and he was looking at me, and he was making eye contact with me, and he was dropping packs of Pokemon cards into this brown paper bag while we're like dead-eyed looking at each other. and the phone rings at the stand, and like I've only just started looking at this kid, and the phone rings at the stand, and I answer the phone, and it's Ben on the other line. He says, "What are you doing right now?" I said, "I'm looking this kid dead ass in the eyes while he's stealing Pokemon cards." And Ben was like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, it's craziest thing, Ben. I said, "He's looking at me right now. I'm on the phone talking to you. I'm even talking about him stealing, and he's looking right at me as he loads this paper bag with Pokemon cards." He was like, "We got to stop him." I said, I'll stop him. And so Ben tells me whatever it is he's going to tell me about the day or whatever, like whatever he needed from me. He tells me, I'm like, okay, gets off the phone. This kid goes to turn and walk away. I said, "Let me see what's in your bag." He goes, "What?" I said, "Let me see what's in your bag." And he goes, "I don't have nothing in my bag." I was like, dude, I just sat here. We locked eyes. I watched you scoop Pokemon cards into the bag. And then he made the kids make the dumb, sad face when they get caught. And he's like, and opens it up. And I take my cards out and I put them back in the display. And I'm like, "Goodbye." And he just walks away.
Wow.
I didn't call security or anything because I was like, it was so stupid that I was like, how can I even explain this to anybody? Like, he was caught so red-handed that I was just like, just give him back and get out of here.
Just go. Just please leave.
Yeah.
That's funny. This kid's just literally the worst criminal possible. No attempt to of subterfuge.
Nope.
No try to hide. Just throws in the bag and figures this is fine.
I think he thought if I was looking at him in the eyes and I wasn't looking at his hands, I think he thought he was like a magician and it was like misdirection. So if we were staring into each other's eyes, I couldn't tell where his hands were, which was not the case.
He has to put the bucket over your head first, and then he can do that.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, that's crazy. Wow. I remember Pokemon was a big thing. I was not a Pokemon guy at all. I think I was like a little too old for it, I think, when it first hit, you know? I kind of just aged out of it. Mm-hmm. But I can imagine what other like big, I can't imagine how that store must have been during big releases, like console releases. And you guys have stories about that? Like those big events, you know, just what that required. I mean, you told me about Julien, you were talking about the 40-hour shifts you were pulling for the holidays. Man, I can't imagine what you guys would have to go through.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as far as like big stuff, like even big games, you know, because again, you know, being an indie store, we're not getting the pre-release drops that it's like, well, you can't put this out until release day. You know, we're getting our stuff either day of, if we're lucky, or the day after, which is more likely because, you know, our distributors get it like the day before, then ship it out the day of to us, and then we get it the day after. So for really big releases, like there were times when like Teresa was really big about this, and sometimes I would go with her, or I would just like go on my own and help her. Like we would just go to like a big box store and just buy a couple of copies and then just sell them at cost, you know, just to be like, so that we would have it on the shelf for our customers. Sure. Okay. Like wow. I remember doing that a lot of times, and with consoles also, because you know there's like no markup on video game consoles. Like what the customer pays is what the retailer pays, basically. Really? Especially back in those days. So wow. You know, like when the PS2 was hard to find, like Teresa would be out there on the hunt, and she would, you know, find one or two here and there, and then, you know, bring them back, and we weren't selling them for like a ridiculous markup or anything like that. There were definitely times when stuff would be marked up, higher just because of demand, and like we would also have to pay more, right? Like,
Sure.
I remember my first holiday season, and we talked about this too, Bill, was GoldenEye.
Yes.
Because even though GoldenEye had come out like months before in the year, for some reason it was huge that holiday season, and we were one of the only stores to get it, but we were having to pay like $5 to $10 higher, than we would normally have to pay for it. So the retail price was $5 to $10 higher than our price normally was, but we still couldn't keep them in stock. And there were so many situations like that, or just like, I remember I got back into wrestling because of Game Fellas, because we had a line of customers waiting out the door at open, like before we opened the store, for WWF Warzone for the PlayStation. And I was like, why are these people waiting for a wrestling game? And then then I started to do a little more looking, and I started like, oh, this Stone Cold Steve Austin guy is kind of interesting. And then I played the game, and I was like, this game is really fun. And then that's when I fell back into wrestling really hard.
It's amazing how a game can do that, right? Yeah. Go ahead, John.
I think that's how Julien and I actually kind of got to know each other, was through wrestling and like both kind of watching it and being into it. I think I was just getting into it from working at KB, because we'd get the figures.
That's my favorite story.
Immediately. And I was just like, who are these people? Like I had never really been into wrestling, and I'm just like, who's the Undertaker? Does he go to Wendy's like that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, who is this guy? And it was a confluence of things. I had seen Mick Foley on TV and thought that he was interesting and funny. And then we all went to see Beyond the Mat together, I believe. And really, I think Julien and I, probably the icebreaker for us, more than video games just as a thing, I think the icebreaker for us was probably pro wrestling.
Yeah, because I got to see John's like de-evolution into wrestling like in real time, because I was there the day that John asked, what is Kane like when he's off work? Like what is he doing? And then, just flash forward a couple years, and John knows far more about wrestling than I ever did.
You dove hard in, John?
Yeah, I did. I definitely did. The thing is, the launch that I probably remember the most, I mean, the PS2 was weird because the consoles were just so hard to find. Like, we just never had them. I want to say
Dreamcast was way more fun.
We went forever without Xboxes too, for some reason. Like, I seem to remember us like not even like the Xbox was just a non-entity altogether. And the PlayStation 2s, from what I remember at Barton, was the PlayStation 2s, we might get one or two here or there. Or again, like Julien said, maybe we might pick one up, and it might be a way for us to move some games. So we'd be like, it'd be the same price. We weren't putting a markup on it, but it would be like, we're only selling it to somebody who's also going to buy 2 PlayStation 2 games. Like, you can buy it, but you have to buy 2 PlayStation 2 games as well.
Right.
Because there is no margin. Like, sometimes I think I saw the margin on them once, and it was like $8. Like, that was the markup.
Are you kidding me?
On a $300 system. Yeah. So
wow,
you're getting it wholesale. You're paying like $2.92 for something you're supposed to be selling for $2.99.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's bizarre. I never would have guessed that, huh?
Yeah.
Just very quickly, where do the margins come from?
For us, it was used games. Like, it was the stuff that buybacks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But the Dreamcast in particular, we had the systems, but a lot of people forget about Dreamcast's kind of disastrous launch involving all the launch titles. That like, what was it? Like a third to 50% of the launch titles were defective.
Yeah, it was bad. And it wasn't even like from one publisher. It was like across the board.
Wow.
So that was just a disaster. I think we were actually, even us, I think we were able to get like, we were able to send those back and actually get like credit with our distributors and stuff. But
the story I always
think there was like,
is... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. You might know more than I do, because I wasn't, management then.
Oh no, I don't. I just think back as like how excited I was the day that Robert Rodriguez came into the store that Christmas to buy a Dreamcast. And he came into Game Fellas to drive me. I'm like, oh yes, it's Robert Rodriguez, the director. He's going to buy a Dreamcast from me. And how happy I was to sell Robert Rodriguez this Dreamcast and like 5 Dreamcast games. And then how dejected I was to see him the next weekend because he couldn't get any of the games to play and he wanted his money back. And it's like, oh, I get to do the return as well.
Oh, wow.
This sucks.
So you actually had a full arc with Robert Rodriguez in your story. The triumph of him buying and the nadir of him returning it because they don't work. I forgot the Dreamcast launch was so disastrous with games not working and such.
Yeah.
Wow. I was kind of out of gaming a bit during that era, so I have very little recollection of it firsthand. But man, wow. That sounds... I can't imagine the customer confidence and all that could have just... Ugh.
Yeah, it was rough. And I was dealing with it on both ends because I was at KB Toys and Game Fellas. So I had a front row seat for it on two different retail experiences because it was like, again, there was no rhyme or reason to it. It was just a matter of some of the games worked and some of them didn't. And they straightened all that out after Christmas because then they were able to start getting the ones that worked into circulation. But yeah, there's a part of me that wonders how different the console wars would have been had that first Christmas not Sega hadn't shot themselves in their own face.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So through your time at the stores, it sounds like you both maybe, I know Julien, you specifically, you opened a bunch and I had no idea that you had opened so many. Even the idea of moving a store from one place to another in the mall sounds like a Herculean effort. Like I can't imagine. And also, I remember when stores would move, I would usually not go back. It was like, oh, I guess this store is gone. It's now a Lamb's Candies or something. Not to get super regional. Like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm not going there anymore. How was that experience in that, like opening stores? Like that just sounds really interesting.
Well, that I think speaks to just like the indie nature of the store and the personality of the stores, because like before we would be moving. Like John's an artist. I used to be an artist. So we would do like just really elaborate fun stuff with art. So like we had like a grease board, in the front of the store, and we would change that, every day or every other day with different things. Like for a while there, I was doing like gamer trivia, and you would get like a 10% discount if you got it. And then awesome. Like that was like on a small grease board, and then the big grease board had like the new big hot releases, and we would do like some sort of nice like bit of art or something like that, like you see at like certain like indie like ice cream places and stuff like that. Yeah. And then for like moving, like I still have them. Like I would do these massive like Bristol board size like comic book, like the stuff that like comic book artists use for like their pages. Mm-hmm. That's the size of the sign, and it would be like Game Fellas is moving, and it would have like all of us in like little cartoon style like moving boxes and letting people know when we were moving, where we're moving to,
that's cool.
And all that stuff. And like I think back to like all the little things that we used to do like that gave the store personality. Like we had a like Rob, the NES Rob mm-hmm. on the counter, and he would change throughout the years, like because originally we had like one of those like desk, like the small cardboard cutout for Final Fantasy VII, where it's just mm-hmm. like the classic cover art. But eventually it got kind of ratty and messed up, so someone took the Buster Sword and cut it out of the cardboard thing, and then put it into Rob's hand.
That's so fun.
And then somebody else made like a nice little like artistic rendering of Cloud's hair, and then made that as kind of like a hat for Rob.
That's good.
And then like another time I have a picture of this actually, but we had two standees for, I think one was NFL Extreme, and then the other one was like NFL Game Day. And the one for NFL Extreme was like the guy's running, but he's looking behind him and he looks a little bit scared. And so someone cut out the head of one of the football players from the Game Day one and gave him these demonic eyes and just slapped it behind him and said, "You can't run forever." and then,
that's so good.
And then they put a little like speech bubble of him screaming, and like that was just the type of store that the Game Fellas was.
And that's cool, because what freedom of expression, right? You just had the freedom to express yourself, and especially as younger people, right? You start. I mean, Julien, it sounds like you started there super young, and just the opportunity to do that and to have the freedom to do that. No one said, "Oh, no, you got to get that out from the front. We have to put up this thing, this advertisement from this place." What a fun environment for not only you, but for your customers to come in. It's just fun and lively. And in here in Austin, everything's about Austin Weird, which of course is rapidly deteriorating in front of our very eyes. Can't go into that right now.
Yeah.
But what a fun thing.
And Bill, we would win like Best of Austin from Austin Chronicle. Like,
oh, get out of here. Really?
Yeah, we would get those Best of Austin awards from Austin Chronicle. And that was the thing is like Julien talks about being upset with like the GameStops and things like that. I still have a beef with what's the name? Nordstrom's, which to me was like that was the thing with us moving in Barton Creek.
That was the first nail in the coffin.
Yeah, we had a hold on just a second. Sorry. My computer went into sleep mode and I hope am I still connected?
Yeah,
you're here.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, we had a spot that we had kind of carved out that we were in
custom.
Yeah, and we moved from that into, and I was just about to say, we moved from that into a custom build. So we moved from that. The mall finally went, you know what? We're not going to treat you guys like second-class citizens anymore. You don't have to take a temporary spot, which a lot of times, I think prior to that, we were in temp spots. You get a cut on the rent, but the mall gets to move you out basically. Whenever somebody wants that spot, the mall can say, hey,
oh, wow,
go someplace else in the mall.
Huh.
So that had happened a couple times, and the mall finally said, great, we're giving you this spot. It's going to be next to Montgomery Ward's, which I think had not closed at the time or was having their problems at the time. And so we were right next to there. We did a whole carve out. We had a nice, what was supposed to be a permanent store next to an anchor store. And we did the best business that Game Fellas had ever had. It was holding its own. I mean, I don't want to speak to the retail numbers we were doing, but they were doing as well as KB Toys.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah. And what happened was Montgomery Ward's went bankrupt. Nordstrom's took over that end of the mall at Barton Creek, and Nordstrom's clause in their lease was that they could determine who their neighbors were. And
they didn't want any like independent stores in their wing.
Yeah. So Nordstrom's is actually who kind of gave us the boot in a roundabout way, because we had to then tear out the quote unquote permanent store that we were only in for maybe 2 years.
Yeah.
And then
so Build-A-Bear could go in.
Yeah. So Build-A-Bear could go in there. Mm-hmm. And so if you're ever in the Barton Creek Mall, Build-A-Bear, that's our old Game Fellas. And then the temporary spot we got moved to the old Spencer spot. We were in there for a little while. That was always funny because we'd have people coming in and asking where Spencer's was, with their like chain wallets and and those weird
Jenkos.
Those finger cuff things that look like those medieval. They're like finger. I don't know how to describe them. It's like armor for one finger.
Oh, yes, the finger sleeves.
Yeah.
Metal finger sleeves.
And you can see somebody walking in with those. You'd be like, oh, they're looking for Spencer's. Hey, man, where's Spencer's? It's like, yeah, okay. All right. And then they moved us from there into the worst place that we were in Barton Creek Mall, because, again, we'd gone from temporary, permanent, quote unquote, and then temporary. And the last temporary spot was a Thomas Kincaid gallery. The Thomas Kincaid gallery is designed in such a way that the store is essentially a big zigzag. And so if you're behind the counter, you can't see past certain areas because the walls are designed in such a way where it's supposed to be for display of paintings. So it zigzags as much as it does so that you can use all that space for displaying Thomas Kincaid paintings. Right. In a game store, it's a nightmare because you can't see the front of your store.
And also the front end of the store was basically like maybe 1/8 of what our permanent spot was.
Yeah, it looks like a closet.
I've seen those. Like I can personally visualize exactly what that looks like. That is not a place for a store. No, that is not a retail space.
No, it wasn't. And then from there, we went. We can't really function in here, so we tried strip malls, and the strip mall thing is really where that's where kind of my final days at Game Fellas, where we'd move the Barton Creek store out into a strip mall, and it just it didn't sustain our regular customers. And we had regular customers that we would see in the mall, people that would go to the mall. Some people would go every day, but a lot of our customers we'd see once a week, that sort of thing. We stopped seeing them altogether. We got almost no walk-in traffic. It was, and then things started, and then things started getting tight, and it was just a matter of like, you're a manager, so you know the money coming in. And for me, it was a matter of kind of going like, the situation is too dire for me to stay on, especially since like Ben was there all the time anyways, and it was kind of like, there's no reason to keep me on if the money is just not coming in this particular strip mall location. And so that's kind of when I exited. Was the also the fun of working with a team was gone, because we weren't busy enough to have those lines at the counter anymore. And it was a case of like, well, it's either just me or it's just Ben. And maybe some days we have some overlap, but other than that, we're just working by ourselves in a store that's seeing no foot traffic. And the fun was gone.
Yeah. That's a shame. And that is really a shame. And I can see you going to that strip mall model, just, no foot traffic. How could you possibly maintain that energy? Yeah. Julien, since we're kind of talking about this side of this experience, kind of where were you in these moments of kind of a little bit of turmoil?
Okay, so mine starts a little bit before the turmoil. There was another location at Lakeline Mall that was part of the other Game Fellas side of things. Basically, one of the former North Cross employees had like kind of done like a 50-50 with the owner of that store and opened his own store at Lakeline. And we also heard similarly like dodgy things about that location. And then right before Christmas season of 2000, they all bounced. Like the entire staff just walked out.
Oh, wow.
And they just left they closed it, but they just left the store and said, we're done. And so they sent me and like one other guy to basically go and work it. And it was a disaster. It was like the worst organized mess I had ever seen. Just like tons and tons of boxes of console decks, but you didn't know what they were, like what decks they were, or what these cables were for.
Oh no!
Just piles of empty like N64 boxes, and just a complete mess. And the store itself was like this mishmash of like fixtures and stuff like that. It looked like a Frankenstein store.
Wow.
And we had Nelson he came with me from one of our satellite stores at Barton, because at this point we had also opened like our own, like it was like a Pokemon store that also did like comics and movies, and so he worked there, but he came out with me. And then we had like a couple people that were there but didn't really stick, and it took a little bit, but slowly and surely we got the place cleaned up and organized, and then we started to get just some really amazing people. And my team at that store, that like the team that I consider like the ones that were like the core group, were just phenomenal. And they all became friends like as we worked there. And that's when that store got its personality, where like Ryan, he was the youngest. I think he was 16 when he started, maybe 17. So he was like the age I was when I started. I used to call him MacGyver because he would just come up with just the coolest little inventions. Like, he would like automate these like signs like out of like pieces of old consoles and stuff like that. And then like Jeff was like this great artist, and he was just a funny guy. Like, and that was the thing, is that like that's when like I think a lot of the fun came back to it for me. Like it had been gone maybe for like just a brief period.
Sure.
But like, we just had this great group, and we like, I would argue we might have been the most passionate gamers like of like the whole thing. And there were just little things like we would do like Final Fight sound effects. Like Jeff would be at the front of the store, he would go, "Yarr!" And then in the back you would hear Jack go, "Yarr!" And I just started to get really invested in it, because even though I wasn't technically like the manager, right, I was still basically running the store. And so we started running tournaments, and that started to bring in like a lot of people coming to the store, and we ended up tripling the sales from what the old staff was, enough to the point that we got our own custom spot right next door. And we really like made that something special. And so then we had like, an employee pick section where everybody had their own little shelf and they would put different games on there. And it had like
cool.
little cartoon pictures of us with like a bio saying like, this is who this is the type of games they like. So if you're curious, you can come to ask them about this type of stuff. Yeah. We had like this Pocky sign that Ryan made out of like the disk drive of a Sega Saturn where like you would press a button and it would slowly spin this empty Pocky box.
That's like, cool.
And then we had like a fan art wall. Like we would get like customers to bring in art and we would post it on the wall. And
what agency? That's so great.
It was awesome. And like I remember our Super Smash Brothers Melee tournament got so big that I had to separate it into heats because the mall was like, you can't have this many people in your store.
Wow. You actually got occupancy restrictions.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So that's and we were doing really well. And unfortunately, other things were not doing really well. And it took a little bit for me to really understand what was happening. And because John, when did those stores close?
I left before San Antonio closed. They were still going when I left San Antonio because they to give some backstory on that, it was the same kind of deal where there was a store that was it had some problems with the staff, problems with the management, that needed somebody to go in there quick and keep the store going, keep the store running. And I went over there, and again, it was a matter of putting some care into it, seeing sales go up tremendously just by making some small changes. Like, hey, instead of letting employees play games all day, they can't play games and they have to greet people when they walk in. And it's like, yeah, maybe it's not as fun, but hey, we actually sold things. And so I was there a couple of years. They opened a second. We ended up getting enough traction to open a second store in San Antonio, but I moved back to Austin before either of the stores closed.
That's right. I remember that now. Yeah.
I came back to Austin, and I was at that time. We were in the permanent spot, I think, by Montgomery Woods when I came back, or maybe we were in the Spencer spot. I can't remember where the location was, but I came back to Barton Creek in the final days of Barton Creek.
I always think of San Antonio and you as being synonymous because I always think of you as being the runner of those stores, but I forgot that like the last guy that was in charge of those two places I really didn't like, and those places, they took a nosedive, and so they ended up closing before anything, and that's when I really started to realize that things were bad. Like Ryan and I went to E3 2004 and then came back, and it felt like it was like all of a sudden everything was on fire, and
wow.
like we weren't getting new games anymore. And then it was like a pretty quick exit from that store. Ooh. And it just kind of happened like out of nowhere, and like it still breaks my heart because I think that store should have been the one to survive. Because we were doing the best, and I think that if we had kept going with just that location, I think we could have pulled out of that nosedive. But there were too many other factors leading into that demise to stem the tide. I think a large part of it was hubris. I think we got to a point where we were like, well, we're game fellas, right? Like we're the best in Austin. Like people come from all over the state to come shop with us. Not noticing that, like, well, yeah, but you can get these games everywhere now, right? Like, It became a point where it's like, yeah, GameStop was carrying all of the weird, obscure stuff that we were carrying, and people didn't really care about imports anymore because the PlayStation 2 couldn't run them very easily. And, like stuff like the wall scrolls and soundtracks that we sold, that was really helpful. But then other places started to carry that stuff as well. So we started to lose what made us special, and I don't think that we really realized it until it was too late.
I saw it as well as being like, I think one of the things that I began to notice was shortly after the launch of the PS2, games were being overpublished. And so we're buying, let's say we're buying 20 copies of a game, and it's a $50 game, and we're buying them at $40 a pop. Okay. And so our markup on it is $8 to $10, and that's pretty typical for like a game. So what's happening is we're getting this launch title, we're getting 25 to 50 copies of it in, $40 a pop. 2-3 weeks, Walmart has the same launch title for $20, or GameStop has the same launch title for $20, because at GameStop they're going, we over ordered by the warehouse full. And so they're marking it down to nothing, and we're still sitting on the copies that we have because we can't put it at $20, or we're taking a $20 loss on every single copy. And that started to happen with more and more titles after. I would say it was not in the early days. It was what we really started to see happen after probably the first year of the PS2.
State of emergency.
These AAA titles, or that would be over published, over ordered by the big box guys, and then we couldn't sell it. We couldn't sell it at the price we had, and if we were going to mark it down, it meant we were literally eating that money, and that became a really difficult proposition. I think if we had future goggles on, I think that going niche into the collectible gaming thing might have saved us, but there's no way that we would have known that.
Yeah,
sure.
And that was also
easy.
the thing.
It's very hindsight for me to say that, but we can see now that that's a viable store model. But at the time, we didn't know if or when that would be a viable store model, and we needed to know there and then in that moment.
Yeah, and even then, like game collecting as you know it now, that still wasn't much of a thing. Like, I remember I would have like some customers come in and say like, well, but like, what if this game that is really rare comes in? Like, do you give it like this much? And I'm like, no, we give it this much because we're only going to sell it for this much, because our used games were very, very affordable. So like, I remember like the only like Super Nintendo stuff that was like really expensive was like the Final Fantasy titles, Chrono Trigger,
right,
Earthbound. Right. But even then they were $50, where like our other Super Nintendo games were like 10 or 5.
15. Yeah.
Like I remember, like, it still blows my mind when I see copies of Final Fantasy VII selling for like over $50, because I remember having stacks upon stacks upon stacks of that game and selling it for $7.99 because so many were produced and it was a very popular seller. But that was the thing, is that our prices were like super reasonable, and we got the really good stuff in because it wasn't this thing where people were expecting to get like $250 in store credit or cash for this particular rare game because we're going to sell it for like $400 or $500. Like, that just wasn't a thing, unless it was like Neo Geo. That was the one thing. Like, we had like those games, I think we would probably give like 75 or 80 in like credit and sell those for like like 120 or something like that, because they retailed for like $300.
Yeah.
But really that was not a thing back then. But I agree with John. I think if we had pivoted more into the used stuff and really like marketed that as the big thing and scaled way back on the new ordering, and then eventually maybe even get off of ordering new titles, that might have done it, because there weren't really any stores that did that as far as like only cover like used stuff. Plenty of stores do now, but
yeah, I mean, here in Austin, Game Over Video Games, of course, which is the big one that's everywhere.
Which is, I have come to appreciate them now, but I was very salty for a bit because the owner of Game Over Video Games came and picked over our corpse at the beginning.
Oh, no.
He would come in and he was real friendly, and he would like buy a bunch of stuff from us and ask us a bunch of questions. And then I went into the first Game Over Video Games and I saw who it was, and I was like, I sold that to you.
Oh, wow.
And
so he kind of
and I was salty about that for a really long time, but I'm not anymore. I think they do really great stuff. I've shopped with them a lot. They're the closest thing to what Game Fellas was that you can get, minus the ability to try stuff out.
And I bring that up because I know David. I've met him. He's actually been on the show.
Yeah.
He's one of my first guests and all. And he's a really good dude, and he has a good heart for games and for industry and for retail. Like, he's not trying to screw you over. Like,
no,
at least I feel like it. I don't
keep in mind I was 25 at the time, and I was very emotionally invested in my store.
Yes, for sure. No, totally, and that's totally right. So we're just to kind of run out of time a little bit. Thanks for going a little long, by the way. I appreciate it.
Oh, are you kidding?
I would.
By Nerds Without Pants standards, we're just getting warmed up.
I know. Oh, I know. I could go for another hour. Probably. My daughter most likely is going to wake up within the next 15, 20 minutes.
That's fair.
And she's 1.5, and she don't care what I'm doing.
She doesn't want to hear our stories.
She could care very little. She's like, diaper kind of full. Get me up. But I want to thank you guys for taking the time and going through this, because I think I personally find it really interesting, the behind the scenes of retail, because I think there is a magic to retail. And that's going to sound very corny and cheesy. I'm a corny and cheesy dad guy. That's kind of what I do now. But there is a magic to it, right? That personal connection, not the white glove treatment, but like you said, concierge. That's like really good way of putting it, where you're going to lead someone to a new discovery, as opposed to me just looking at a Metacritic score and saying, or something along those lines, or a review and say, oh, it's a 9 out of 10. Cool, I'll buy that. You may lead somebody to that 7 out of 10 that they love. That's like, oh, you dig this. Well, this is a gem for you that you can get connected to.
Yeah.
The easy question is obviously what's lost in retail, what's lost in moving away from that retail space. But man, I guess the encouragement would be to people, if you have a local game store in your town, please go there.
Yeah,
right? Like,
absolutely.
Please go there, especially if it's not, again, not trying to slag off on GameStops, because they are run by real people who can care. But if you have a local video game store, or anything, any local thing, again, in my world in food and beverage here in Austin, you'll hear people bemoan when a restaurant closes, right? This restaurant's been here 50 years. Now they closed last month because of the pandemic or whatever. And my question to them is usually, when's the last time you went?
Yeah.
And the answer is usually, it's been a couple of years. Well, that's probably half your problem. That's why, right? So I guess, what would you say? I mean, I guess as a sum up of your experience at your experience at Game Fellas, kind of, I don't know, what do you want to leave people with?
For me, like I said at the beginning, like they were the best years of my life, and I miss opening that store and picking the games that I was going to put on the consoles at least for the morning, until someone came into place to try something, and I miss like, if I hear the theme song for Eco, or the attract mode for Final Fantasy Tactics, or Scar's Tear by from Chrono Cross, I get choked up because it just takes me back to that time. And I miss like our regular customers, like Omar, who would be waiting for me before I even got there, and he would hang out there all day, almost every day, and like sometimes I'd be like, hey Omar, can you go get me a drink? And he'd be like, yeah, sure, man. And he would like go and get me a drink when I was the only one working. He was like my only sale on 9/11 because he was there, and John was actually the person who told me what was happening.
Wow.
And just like, and my guys, like I miss my guys so much. It was just a really special time, and yeah, I'm so happy that I got to be part of that.
Yeah, it sounds like a really special time. And again, it's always about the people. It's about the people you're with, right? And again, it's no matter what industry you're in. Again, I think everyone listening can identify with that, even if it's not even a working situation. Just those group of people that you grew up with and grew with as a person, I think is pretty special. What about you, John? Well,
real quick, I just want to say that I do think that even though I didn't come to podcasting because I wanted to do a podcast, it was kind of thrust upon me. But the reason that I've done it for 10 years is I think that it's in some way fills that void of just because, but between customers, we would talk about video games and we would laugh about stuff. And I remember like we were across from Tony and Guy, which was like a hair salon place, and they had so much drama at that store. They would always come out and like cry and like vent to each other. And meanwhile, we're across the hallway just like laughing at some stupid joke. Or like Will dresses in a Batman costume for kids, even though he's like almost 7 feet tall, and like runs out into the middle of the mall on a dare and does cartwheels as he comes back into the store. Like
you could see his Batarang.
That was my store. Yeah, you could definitely see his Batarang. It was not subtle.
Oh man, it's those memories, right? It's again, not to belabor the point, but that's why I want to have this conversation, because it felt like, just from the quick conversation I had with you, Julien, about this, I thought, oh wow, there's a connection there. Like there are stories there.
Oh, I could go
John,
for days.
I know, man. I wish I had days. I love all this stuff. I love hearing about these little stories. John, what about you, man? What would you encourage people to do in our landscape? Yeah,
I've made lifelong friends there. I think people still crave it. I think people still crave the personal touch, even as stuff does move more online. I think for me, the overall biggest life lesson that I've come back to again and again, I'll let Julien have the last word on the human connection of it all. But for me, the personal lesson of it was that, going back to that original thought of me not being good enough, me not knowing enough, me not being knowledgeable enough, me, I needed the work and I wanted it, but me just going in is like, I'm not going to be as good as everybody else. And that's something that I have referenced, that Gamefellas moment of being like, that discovery that like, oh no, like everybody's just as dumb as me. It's everybody knows what they know. And I think that's the thing is like, then that kind of like helped me get into art school, because it was like, I could have, if I wouldn't have had that, I would have carried that into art school and been like, I'm not going to be the best person in my class. I'm going to suck compared to everybody else. And I think that really that very first lesson that I got from working there, where I was just like, I'm going to know what I know and they're going to know what they know, and I'm the only one that can bring me to the table. That has come up again and again and again. It's come up in the sketch comedy that I do here in Austin. It's come up in the artwork that I do, that it's a matter of just, I'm going to bring me, and I have my own strengths and everybody else has their own strengths, but I'm not going to be any better or worse than anybody else, if that makes sense. And it's helped me tremendously, because it's probably something I struggled with more before I ever worked at Gamefellas versus after I've worked at Gamefellas. I know that there's, I'll leave it at that, because I agree with all the stuff Julien says. And again, I think the experience, the customer experience, the interpersonal relationship stuff, I don't have anything to add to what Julien has already said. So mine is just that, really, that life lesson that's paid off for me.
After this recording, we were doing our wrap-up, and Julien expressed the desire to see some of his old friends from Gamefellas again, to swap those stories and sit around the virtual campfire. If you worked at Gamefellas at some point during that era and would like to do so, please reach out to me on Twitter at agamerlooksat4040. My DMs are open. I would love to reconnect you with Julien. Thank you so much for checking out this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40. If you haven't done so already, reach out to me on Twitter at A Gamer Looks at 40. That's where I spend most of my time on social media. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, if you prefer those platforms. Ratings and reviews on iTunes and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all the podcatchers and all the podcast platforms are greatly appreciated. And I mentioned my Patreon earlier, so I won't chew that cabbage again. Thanks as always for checking out the show, and continue staying awesome.